I wanted to give you a bit of a warning. There are some issues with my guest's audio. My producer, Landry Ayers, worked a lot of magic to clean it up, but there are some words lost here and there are some issues with a few of the guest's answers towards the end. Landry and I agreed to release it anyway, because we both think the conversation is important, as it offers a genuinely new way of thinking about the kinds of politics we talk about on Reimagining Liberty, and so it's of great value. I'm sorry for the lower quality audio than is typical of the show, but I hope you'll stick around. Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. Liberals, particularly classical liberals and libertarians, have too narrow a view of power. They focus on government force or the threat of government force and ignore all the other ways power is exercised in society. And the way classical liberals and libertarians imagine the fully autonomous self is at odds with our deep cultural embeddedness and the social construction of our identities, our ways of seeing, and the concepts through which we come to understand ourselves and the world. That's the argument my guest sets out in his new book, which asks classical liberals and libertarians to take seriously the analysis of power, knowledge, and identity set out by the French theorist Michel Foucault. And, as Mark Pennington further argues in Foucault and Liberal Political Economy, Power, Knowledge, and Freedom, taking Foucault seriously strengthens the foundations of liberalism and makes it better able to respond to illiberal critiques. Pennington is professor of political economy and public policy in the Department of Political Economy, King's College, University of London, and is director of the Center for the Study of Governance and Society. We discuss Foucault's ideas and introduce them for listeners who know nothing about his theories, and we show how they can point to liberal conclusions, including individual rights and a free market economy. Mark's book is the book I've been wanting someone to write for a long time. And it not only doesn't disappoint, but is, I think, one of the most important books in the liberal tradition in decades. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported show. If you'd like to listen to episodes uninterrupted by ads from our sponsors, you can become a supporter. You'll get my newsletter ad-free as well. To learn more, head to www.aaronrosspowell.com. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Mark. What do classical liberals and libertarians miss or not see or overlook about the nature of power?
Well, I think they tend to see power as very much something that is directed over individuals in a very straightforward manner. So it can be in the form of violence, it can be in the form of theft. They don't tend to see the perceptible processes that trap people in sort of modes of thought, which actually limit the kinds of actions that they might carry out. Now, I think there's nothing in classical liberalism or libertarianism that prevents people from thinking about those kinds of questions. But people haven't really got a sort of conceptual toolkit, perhaps, to think about those things. And one of the things that interests me about Foucault is that he's a thinker who provides that kind of toolkit to think about the ways in which power can be exercised over people through modes of thought, or what he would call discourses.
Is part of that hesitancy derived from kind of a cultural feature of libertarians and classical liberals, which is essentially you don't talk like a communitarian. You don't admit communitarian critiques, that this is about individuals and individual choices, and everything you just said, Mark, sounds suspiciously communitarian.
I think that's right. But that's really it's a very strange view when you look at some of the key thinkers in the classical liberal or libertarian tradition. I mean, obviously there's quite a lot of variety in that. But if you look at somebody like Friedrich Hayek, and this is one of the themes that comes out in my book, he's very much of the view that people are social products, that much of their rationality comes from their culture. In economic situations, it's not that people have got a pre-existing rationality outside of the market. The market actually creates in many senses, their rationality. So, some key thinkers in the liberal tradition do take on board the idea that there isn't just a sort of atomized self. And once you recognize that, then you can also recognize that power can be exercised over agents in ways that aren't simply reducible to violence or standard forms of coercion, if you like. I think recognizing that should be something that people in the classical liberal tradition feel perfectly able to do, because they've got a set of tools that can actually push back against maybe some of the normative implications that more communitarian thinkers would take from that. So I think recognizing that power is exercised in this way doesn't lead you necessarily to any particular kind of normative conclusion.
Let's talk about then what's meant by power in this context. I was talking about your book with a friend last week, and who seemed a little bit skeptical about Foucault. And what he said to me was, he said, well, a lot of this seems to depend on your definition of power. And Foucault has a very particular definition that is different from the power is simply the application of state violence or the threat of state violence that libertarians tend to use. So what does he mean by that? And can you give us some examples of what a Foucault notion of power looks like in the world?
So he defines it. I mean, it's quite a complex definition, but he defines it as the complex strategic situation you find in any society. And there are different elements to that strategic situation. So he thinks power is exercised over people through attempts that people deploy to, as he would put it, conduct the conduct of other actors. So it's an attempt to engage some kind of influence over other people. So you try to kind of impose, if you like, a particular construction on the world or upon other people within it. And what he's concerned about is that whole sort of webs of practices or networks of ideas can develop from multiple individuals trying to influence other individuals. And as a kind of unintended consequence of that, you get ideas becoming established, frames of reference becoming established that routinize certain forms of behavior that can, in extremis, kind of freeze people into a particular way of being. So there are all kinds of things in life that we just take for granted about who various authorities in society might be. So we might take it for granted that religious authorities ought to be followed. We might take it for granted that various medical professions, we should follow their advice. We might take it for granted that there are various experts who claim to know what to do in certain economic situations, have a certain kind of authority. So it's the way in which all kinds of taken for granted presuppositions become established and routinized. So I think he believes that power is primarily exercised over people through routines. So that's routines in the things you do in your life, and it's routines in the kinds of relationships of authority that you have with other people that are reinforced and kind of perpetuated.
Is this then a demoralized or non-moralized conception of power? Because when we talk about something like, I exercise power over you, that doesn't necessarily mean that I've done something wrong or morally problematic, but there's an implication. That's like kind of a background worry in it. But what you're describing sounds like power is whenever I or the society that I have played a part in shaping shapes you, influences you, but that could be for good ways too. Like it can improve you to have that power exercised upon you.
Absolutely. So I think what he's saying, and people often miss this in Foucault, because he speaks so much about power, people think that it has this negative connotation. And for him, it absolutely doesn't. He's very explicit in saying that power is productive. So it actually produces the way we understand ourselves, the way we kind of identify ourselves, how we understand our place in the world. comes from these kind of routinized practices. So he doesn't think that it's necessarily bad. If you want to be a good athlete, you've got to follow certain disciplines or routines or practices. So the kind of power that's exercised over you by a certain sport or the coaches that are involved in the sporting practice are not necessarily negative. So he does think power can be beneficial, but he does also believe that it can be negative. So the concern is that things that could be positive in certain situations, if they become a kind of what he would understand as a kind of totalizing form of power that sort of seeps into every aspect of your life, can become something like a form of domination. So power, he says, is always dangerous. That doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. It could be that something that is good in a certain situation, that is useful, could be bad if it kind of multiplies out into multiple other areas. So he has actually, I think, a very nuanced take on what power is. Not the kind of very reductive view you hear in kind of simplistic readings of Foucault, where you will often hear people implying that he thinks everything is negative about the use of power. And he certainly doesn't believe that.
Is this, though, too vague of a definition or too incapable of a delineation to act on from the political institution standpoint? Because this is the concern, like, for kind of a hardcore libertarian, like, non-aggression axiom sort. They're like, the point of government is to prevent, if it's going to exist, it's to prevent this kind of application of power and leave this kind alone. Certain kinds are legitimate, certain kinds are illegitimate, and so on. But to do that, you need to draw a line. But it sounds like it would be awfully hard to draw a line between legitimate and illegitimate, permissible and impermissible in the definition you just gave.
I think it is very hard to draw a line. And I think that is one of the, if you like, profound insights that you can get from Foucault, which is a kind of radical sort of skepticism about many kinds of institutional practices. And that means we've got to be wary about all kinds of situations, even ones where people who are classical liberals or libertarians might think that they are on the side of the angels, if you like. So if you just think, for example, about conceptions of property rights. So I'm a very strong believer in property rights. I think property rights do matter. But conceptions of property rights, what it's reasonable for individuals to own as opposed to communal groups to own, all these sorts of things can vary quite a lot across societies. And if we take a sort of ultra-individual conception of property rights from one setting and impose it in other sorts of settings, you have precisely the type of situation we had under kind of colonial regimes, where people were being told, in effect, that there is one way of respecting property and that a certain set of actors have privileged access to what those rights should look like. And I think there are quite a lot of other examples that are like that, that libertarians should be willing to take heed of, even within, if you like, more individualist or Western type societies. So if you take a question like climate change or many environmental dilemmas, it's actually very difficult in those cases to define what property rights should actually look like. So having a notion of strong individual property rights doesn't necessarily, in many cases, give you this bright line that I think some of the thinkers that you're referring to want to have.
What does this mean then for me as a member of a liberal society? Because your book is a defense of a kind of liberalism.
Yeah.
And so there's a normative weight to it, which is society should be liberal. We should be liberals in the world. That is the correct or better way to be. And so what does everything you've just said mean for me as I navigate the world and interact with others and their property? I guess in terms of action guidedness. So because I could say, look, if I'm in this embedded network of power and discourses and evolved beliefs and values and competing narratives and everything else that fits within the postmodern part of your postmodern liberalism, as you call it. This sounds like I could interpret this as kind of a relativism. Like you've just said that there isn't the bright lines about property don't exist. And so my narrative is I can, take that painting that's on the wall behind you because that's mine and you can say no, but that's yours. So what does this mean in terms of being a liberal citizen?
I think it implies having a very humble approach. So I think it implies humility. And I think this is where there's a great deal of overlap with, for example, thinkers like Hayek, but I'd also include other people like Michael Oakeshott in this kind of tradition as well, where there is a humility that you exercise in your interactions with other agents, precisely because you are, if you like, very uncertain about what the truth is. Now, that also gives rise to a different way of thinking about what liberal institutions do. So I think the strong argument, or the kind of argument I would want to develop for institutions like private property, markets, competition, is precisely that these kind of structures allow for a certain fluidity, but they also kind of reflect a sort of humility as well. That we can recognize that we are all involved in, if you like, systems of power, that we might have interest in perpetuating some of those systems, but that if we have a kind of competitive environment, a pluralistic environment, then we're increasing the chance that those kind of power relations don't freeze up, but multiple possibilities can come into being, and that we don't have any arrogant actors who are claiming that they have possession of the truth that gives them the right to kind of rule over others in a sort of totalizing way. So I think the key implication is be humble in politics.
As you were saying that, I was thinking about the kind of hard conception of property rights versus, I tend to think about things a lot from the perspective of early Buddhist philosophy. And one of the 5 precepts, the second precept is not stealing, and you can ground property rights in that. But the way that it actually translates is don't take what's not freely given to you. And that seems to shift to this like humility kind of approach that it is that this other person has this thing, they haven't given it to me. That's what really matters, even if my conception of property rights is slightly different. It feels like a softer, more like open-handed approach. Yeah.
No, I very much endorse that. That's very much the kind of view that I'd want to have. I think there is, I have no hesitation in calling myself a libertarian. Absolutely no hesitation. But there is something that I've always found quite troubling about the more rationalistic versions of libertarianism, which claim that you can define some underlying set of propositions by using pure reason, if you like. You can define what the ideal set of property rights are. You can define all these things in very bright line terms. There's something very, I'm not quite sure what the right rationalistic is certainly one way of describing that, but there's just something overconfident about it. There's just something sort of arrogant about that kind of approach to doing political theory or political philosophy, if you like, that I've always felt uncomfortable with. And that's personally why I've always been attracted to thinkers like Hayek, much more so than the more abstract kind of rights-based libertarians.
It makes me think of, there's a very good book called Time and Philosophy by a guy named John McCumber about continental philosophy, which Foucault is part of that tradition, where he argues that the distinction between analytic Anglophone philosophy and continental is like a recognition of kind of time and change as deeply embedded, that there aren't these eternal principles that you can unearth through
Yeah.
reason, but that the question is not like what is there, but like how did we get here? Like
Yeah.
why do things look like this now? And that gets to like when you read Foucault, he often reads like he's doing history
Yes.
or archaeology, as
Yes.
he calls it, or
Yes.
genealogy, that it's about tracing discipline and punish. It's about the evolution of ideas of punishment in the prison. Madness and Civilization is about the evolution of his history of sexuality. Can you speak to that? Like how much this kind of doing the work of looking to the past and how they thought about things and how that changes fits into this, I guess, everything we've just talked about in kind of the liberal project.
Well, I think that's very interesting. So I think certainly there's a case to be made that a lot of thinkers in the continental traditions are much more aware of ideas about historical contingency, that what we understand about the world and about ourselves and ways of doing things very often is historically contingent. So they take this kind of longer term look at the evolution of ideas, practices, these sorts of things. And I think that approach is actually very amenable to a sort of liberal worldview. Because the way to think about it is that what those traditions are doing is looking at history as a kind of source of a kind of repertoire of multiple ways of being in the world. So the history illustrates for many of the people in those traditions that there's a plurality of ways of being, and that we can use that understanding that history is fluid, it's varied, it's not sort of moving according to fixed laws, to inform our contemporary practices. So if we've seen that ideas about certain forms of scientific truth have changed according to different historical periods, that might make us think twice today about thinking that we've got something like access to a scientific truth. And I think that kind of view has implications across multiple other sorts of areas. It doesn't mean going back to history in the sense of trying to replicate something necessarily that happened in the past. But it does imply, as I say, seeing history as a kind of repertoire of possibilities, indicating that things can be different.
Does this get at another reason for the skepticism about Foucault, or sometimes the outright hostility to him among libertarians and classical liberals? Because what you just described is, libertarians and classical liberals for a long time have seen themselves as more like allies of conservatism than allies of progressivism.
Yeah.
And, but like a lot of people who become libertarians started on the political right and
Yeah.
so on. But what you've just described seems to be, I can imagine conservatives finding that a very troubling notion, because conservatism, or the right, is very much grounded in this view that there are natural ways of being, there are natural hierarchies that fall out of that. It is wrong to challenge those. It's wrong to undermine tradition or deviate from it. It's wrong to try to ameliorate those hierarchies because they're grounded in natural facts of the world, and so on. And Foucault is, this historical approach is directly challenging that. It is pointing out, it's similar to, I've talked in the show before, I think, about like Roland Barthes' theory of myth, which is, we politicize, it's the political project that falls out of the kind of conservative response to what you just said, which is to take these contingencies, tell a story about why they're natural, and then you can't challenge them anymore. But this does seem deeply troubling to a conservative perspective on, say, social theory.
Well, I think it depends on your definition of a conservative. So if you have conservatives in a particular country, for example, such as the United States, that are trying to defend what they see to be a particular set of rights in that tradition, then yes, I can see how Foucault is seen as disturbing. But the type of approach that I've outlined, or the way I've described what Foucault is doing, or what other people in the continental traditions are doing, is also very amenable to various kinds of conservative thought. So if you take somebody like somebody like Michael Oakeshott, who's a kind of liberal conservative, I think his view is very amenable to Foucault's ideas about historical contingency. So it's not coming from a kind of naturalistic rights-based tradition. It's saying that traditions are often historically contingent. That doesn't mean they're not valuable. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be skeptical about more radical ideas about how they're reformed. And that's a view that's not necessarily hostile to Foucault's type of perspective. So I think Foucault on tradition is actually very interesting. And there are different phases in his writings. So there's certainly a phase in his work where he seems to be implying that because all of these norms or routines that we're embedded in are these historically contingent sort of practices, that we should be constantly destabilizing them. But you have kind of almost permanent revolution, so we can keep escaping from whatever set of practices we become stuck in. That's a theme that is there in his writings in the early 1970s, for example. But by the end of the 1970s and into the early 1980s, he has a much more modest kind of approach, which is that, yes, you want to be challenging these existing practices, but in a much more incremental way. So philosophers would use the term, it's a technical term, but immanent criticism. So that's the idea that you're not throwing all the norms up. You're sort of challenging maybe particular ones at the margin to allow some fluidity and allow for some kind of evolution. And you'd be concerned about the kind of practices that might stop that evolution. So if you understand conservatism as a kind of, like a Burkean skepticism of radical change, or Michael Oakeshott allowing for gradual evolutionary change, then I think that view is perfectly compatible with a kind of Foucauldian recognition that we're always embedded in these historically contingent practices. And it isn't really a properly conservative approach to insist that there are pure natural types. That's much more akin to what I would form kind of scientific naturalism. And I actually don't see that as being compatible with true conservatism, let alone with the kind of liberalism that I would want to advocate.
We've touched on this a little bit, but I think it might be worth having you express clearly is what Foucault means by the relationship between knowledge and power, because that's probably another thing that if listeners have heard of Foucault at all, they probably know he talks about knowledge and he talks about power.
Well, so he believes that people who profess to know truths in various dimensions, those could be truths about individuals, but they could also be truths about a society as a whole. When they make those truth claims, those claims are always through and through affected by power. So we make these kind of claims as part of an attempt to influence other individuals, basically perhaps to get them to do the kind of things that we might want them to do, by implying that we have some knowledge about them or about the society of which they are a part. So power and knowledge are always intimately connected in that sense. He also believes that systems of ideas, for example, in science, even if they're not deliberately created to advance the interests of particular sorts of actors or people, once those systems become entrenched, they create interests that have a stake in perpetuating the set of ideas. So there's no suggestion that notions of scientific expertise in all circumstances were deliberately or have been deliberately created to benefit scientists or give them status. But once certain systems of, say, scientific authority are in place, then people who gain position, social status, or income from being considered to be a scientist may have interests in perpetuating those systems of thought. So you can't separate out claims about scientific truth from an understanding of the fact that science is always embedded in power relations as Foucault would understand it, attempts by some actors to influence others and to gain some kind of authority or status over them through the making of these truth claims.
This again, though, seems to raise the, I guess we'll call it like the concern about postmodernism, that, because that sounds like a very skeptical, so I'm listening to scientists and we argue, you should follow them and not the crackpots on Twitter, but why? And if it's just that they have a certain credential attached to their name, and that implies a certain kind of social status or positioning within society, that doesn't seem to get us there. But is the result then a radical postmodern skepticism of, does that turn into truth is whatever I want it to be, and science is no better than any other way of, astronomy is no better than astrology, and alternative medicine is no better than, John Hopkins cancer research and so on?
No, I don't think it does turn into that. So this perspective is not saying that we shouldn't listen to scientists, or that we haven't got good reasons at certain points in time for taking the advice of people who claim to have expertise. So there can be contingent reasons why we might want, when we look at the track record that certain people have had for giving certain kinds of advice and the impact that might have on people's lives for the good, to follow it. What it does imply is that we should always have this skepticism that because things have turned out in a certain way in the past, it doesn't mean that they necessarily will in the future. And this is particularly true when we're thinking about relationships between human beings, questions about human identity, because human beings are not like the kind of atoms that can be tested or worked upon in a laboratory setting. So it's not saying that we can't say anything about relationships with human beings, but we've got to have this level of skepticism built into the way we think about it. We should always be open to the possibility that the scientists may be wrong, but then it'd be different understandings that come forward. And that means we should be skeptical about giving scientists political authority. Okay, so a big concern in Foucault is about the alignment between claims to things like scientific expertise and state power. So it's not saying that you should ignore all scientific advice, but there'd be a concern about the monopoly of expertise arising through alignment between claims to scientific truth and the power state. It's that kind of thing that he's concerned about. And I think that is, I think all the Foucauldians would see it this way. That is the properly scientifically skeptical attitude take. If you look through the history of science at the number of ideas that have been subject to radical change, even ways of coming to sort of scientific understanding, then it should give us reason to be skeptical of anyone who claims to be discovered some kind of absolute notion of scientific truth.
You have a discussion in the book that I'd love for you to present to listeners as a way of showing some more of application of these ideas about social justice, and which has been, on everyone's minds for quite some time, and there's a lot of debates, and you have this. I think your discussion sheds light on some of this. So, can you talk about what does social justice look like in this context, or what are the ways that we go wrong in talking about social justice?
Okay, so there's it depends which aspect of social justice you are looking at. So one way to think about it might be to separate out social justice understood as concerned about distribution of income and wealth. And another aspect of it might be to think more about the kind of identity aspects of it. So in the sense to do with cultural status of different sorts of groups. What I think is common across those two discussions is the belief that, or this I think is what I would consider to be the dominant narrative, if you like, in today's world, or discussions about social justice, that it is possible to manipulate society to produce what we consider to be just outcomes. So we can look at society, we can see what there is inequalities, imbalances, disequilibria, whatever you want to call them. And we can then manipulate society to produce more desirable or more just outcomes. Now, this is a common view across different political traditions, broadly speaking, on the left of politics, I would say. So we see this view in Rawlsian liberalism, for example. The idea that essentially a set of experts could manipulate social outcomes to produce a kind of just outcome in terms of the distribution of income and wealth. But you also see it in those thinkers who are concerned more about questions of identity or cultural injustice. So lots of discussion around what people refer to as intersectionality, concerns about multiple forms of marginalization associated with sexuality, ethnicity, religion, race, all of these kind of things, where there's a kind of assumption that if there are inequalities on these first dimensions, we could trust to some kind of governing apparatus the capacity to correct them. Now, there are two dimensions to, I think, a kind of Foucauldian argument here, and what I would say is also a kind of classical liberal argument. The first would be a skepticism of the kind of implicit assumption underlying these dominant views that societies are legible or manageable objects in this way. So there is an assumption in all of these theories that society is knowable, that we can understand the way all of the different components interact, and we can manipulate it to produce certain sorts of outcomes. And I think a Foucauldian view would be very much in line with a kind of Hayekian skepticism about the idea that societies are manageable objects in that way. So if societies are what Hayek calls complex phenomena, then it's actually not going to be that easy to figure out how you manipulate them to produce the kind of outcomes that you want. The second implication, I think this is the real sort of Foucauldian argument, if you like, is the belief that societies are legible and can be managed to produce just outcomes leads to the creation of a kind of surveillance society where multiple aspects of what people do have to be monitored, they have to be regulated, they have to be managed, they have to be subject to audits, performance management indicators, all sorts of things, in order to produce what's considered to be the just outcome. So you end up with narratives which are supposed to be about freeing people, giving them more space to move, actually encasing people in a whole network of regulatory controls, not just over the way they act, the things that they do, but even in terms of how they speak. So those are the sorts of issues that I look at in terms of social justice. I kind of question the idea that society is a manageable object in the way that many social justice theorists think it is. But I also look at what Foucault would call the power effects that arise from believing that society is manageable in this way. And I focus on these surveillance networks that develop when we try to pursue social justice in the way many people understand it.
Does this risk leading to a society that, to reference another one of Foucault's most famous ideas, is panoptic? Because there's the actual literal surveillance that has to happen, but there's also then an internalizing of a certain set of behaviors or restrictions, and so then the watchers don't even have to be watching you.
Yes, absolutely. So he speaks about something which he calls pastoral power, which is very similar to the kind of power that used to be exercised by the medieval church over people, where if you feel that the religious authorities in multiple sorts of practices are omnipresent in all aspects of your life, then you start to internalize this kind of power on yourself. So the watcher doesn't need to be bad. And this is true also of multiple forms of policy today that are directed towards social justice. So if you think about various forms of DEI initiatives, this is all about, arguably, in various organizational settings, people being told that they must meet certain targets or goals, the people that they work with, or the various sorts of practices that they should use in terms of speech, these sorts of things. And if people are embedded in these practices, they know that in many circumstances they will be watched. Then they might start to enforce these kinds of disciplines or practices on themselves in much the same sort of way. So this is not an argument against DEI. Okay, it's not saying you should never do things like DEI to improve the experience of gay people or trans people or racial minorities in certain situations. But it is saying that you should be wary of creating this kind of disciplinary apparatus, which ends up controlling the way people interact with each other. And that in many ways can actually reproduce some of the categories that people in actually the sort of gay liberation movement, for example, or some of the racial justice movements have wanted to challenge. So, it's Gay Pride Month at the moment, or Pride Month at the moment here in the UK, what it is in the US. And I think a lot of people might be troubled by the fact that some initiatives around DEI often kind of reproduce stereotypes about gay people or other people in some of the historically disadvantaged groups in ways that actually reinforce various stereotypes. So people are constructed as vulnerable, that if they hear somebody say something about their sexuality, which they might find offensive, they're going to suffer a kind of total psychological collapse. That's actually reproducing negative stereotypes about gay people that many people in the gay liberation movement wanted to challenge. So there's multiple aspects to this. There's a concern about the kind of hypnotic control network that operates when people attempt to implement social justice. But there's also the effect of these on the people that some of these practices are meant to benefit. It's not only the people who potentially are the oppressors, if you like, who can be encased in this cage of control. It's also the people who the practices are meant to help, who can also be frozen into this. And that's one of the key arguments in the book about sort of thinking about the dangerous aspect of some of these practices, if you like, as Foucault said.
One of the things I found particularly valuable about this book, and as I mentioned to you, I said to you before we hit record, I think this book I was like fist pumping throughout reading this. There are passages, all sorts of passages I underlined. It felt like this is the book I've been waiting for someone to write for a long time. And I think it is definitely one of the most important books in the libertarian or classical liberal tradition in a long time. But one of the parts of it that really seemed exciting to me is the way that it opens up avenues for dialogue between classical liberals or libertarians and progressives or the left, because Foucault has been, Foucault's politics were complicated. They seem to evolve over time. There's some question of whether he was classical liberal at certain points or not. He gets pinned as a Marxist by a lot of people, but he probably wasn't, or at least not for very long. All of that is very complicated, but he's claimed as a figure, he's thought of as a figure of the left. And this is a book that is saying, on the one hand, Foucault has a lot of value to classical liberals. But on the other hand, classical liberalism has a lot of value to people who take Foucault's concerns seriously. And so can you, I guess, Can you speak to that? Can you speak to how this positions the possibility of dialogue there?
Well, so I think one of the most interesting aspects of this is Foucault as a social constructionist. So what we've been talking a lot about through the conversation is social constructs, routines, the way in which they can fix people into categories and in extremis almost imprison them. So people who are social constructionists, and most of the progressive left are social constructionists in a sense. Their concerns about the concerns of the feminist movement, racial justice movements, gender justice movements, they're all concerned about not trapping people in stereotypical or routinized categories that often limit people's life experiences. So the way I think about this is what they want is a form of cultural creative destruction, where these routines that often might imprison people in ways of being or doing things get destabilized. So we can have new possibilities for women, for gays and lesbians, for trans people, for racial minorities, all of these kinds of things. And what I ask in the book is, well, what kind of economic system generates this kind of creative disruption that destabilizes routines, creates the space, the opportunities to break down rigid patterns? And I argue, in effect, that something like a kind of libertarian model of a market economy, where new enterprises and new ways of doing things are continually upsetting the apple cart, if you like, of established interests or practices, and allowing new possibilities to come forward. And I think there should be room for a dialogue between, if you look like, the progressive left and libertarians about the type of arrangements that facilitate that and those arrangements that close it down. So if we're concerned about undermining what people on the left would consider to be kind of systemic power structures, what kind of arrangements actually do a reasonable job of doing that? And I think you can make a strong case that dynamic market economies, not market economies that are cartelized by kind of ruling elites, but dynamic market economies, open market economies, facilitate this kind of cultural fluidity and challenge that allows new identities to be created, new possibilities for people to live their lives.
To end, I obviously strongly recommend your book to readers, both for its original contributions and as an introduction to Foucault. But for listeners who have not been exposed to Foucault, have not read him, he's a challenging writer, and he's a writer who is kind of all over the place, and his views have evolved over the course of his career. Do you have a recommended starting point? So someone who listened to this conversation was like, this all sounds fascinating. I'd like to read some Foucault. What should I pick up?
Well, I've got to say, having written this book, it's very difficult. And one of the things that I've tried to do in the book is to use it is an academic book, but I've tried to use relatively straightforward language to translate some of his ideas. So his writing style is actually very varied compared to some of the French postmodernist thinkers. I think he's quite clear. So if you read a book like Discipline and Punish, which is very much about how these kind of decentralized surveillance networks can develop, that's actually quite easy to understand. I think the history of sexuality is quite easy to understand as well. There's a very good essay that he wrote, more like the closest he gets to a kind of conventional analytic philosophy style essay. It's called The Subject and Power, that was written actually just a couple of years before he died, which is almost like a retrospective on what his whole project is about. That's quite a good place to start. But yeah, he is not an easy writer because there are so many different phases of his career. And his views definitely did change over time. So I think he reveled in the fact that he was kind of playing games with people in some circumstances about what his real position actually was. There's a lot of masks he seems to adopt you can't really understand what the real him is. What I've tried to do in the book, though, is not take a view on whether he ever became a classical liberal. And there has been a whole controversy about whether he had to kind of move to liberalism in the final stage of his life. I haven't taken a view on that. What I've tried to do in as straightforward language as I could muster is try to show how, if you look through all of his core writings, there are certain key themes or concepts that are compatible with a sort of liberal view of the world. And so his understanding of human agency, I think, is compatible with a liberal view. His skepticism of scientific authority is very compatible with a liberal view. And also his belief that rights are never neutral in their effects is also actually very compatible with a certain type of liberal perspective. And that's what I've tried to bring out in this book in kind of theoretical terms, but also in practical applications.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Reimagining Liberty. If you'd like to listen to future episodes free of ads and sponsorships, you can become a supporter for just a few dollars a month. Head to www.aaronrosspowell.com to learn more.